How good was the Big Ten in 2024? We discussed this on the Nitro Show, college football from a Georgia point of view. I'm Burl.
And I'm Street.
And today we are talking Big Ten conference grades. We're going to go through the entire roster of teams from the Big Ten, talk about how they did. Was it good? Was it bad? We'll explain our grading system and all that good stuff. And we also just want to give a shout out to those Philadelphia Dogs for winning the Super Bowl.
Dogs.
Go Dogs. 6 members of the 2021 National Championship defense on the Eagles, and they played just like that TCU game in the Super Bowl. So I think they could have been eating chicken wings on the side of at the game that day. But before we continue, we do want to thank you so much for spending your time with us. Hit that like button, drop some comments. I'm wearing my new West Cane and Coyote shirt because it's awesome. Go Mocs. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. Tell your friends. It really helps the show.
Yeah, and as it sits today, we're at 95 subscribers, and we really want to get to 100. So to help drive that, we're going to be having a contest. Once we get to 100 subscribers, we're going to be giving away a couple of autographed Georgia football cards from this set here. This is On It. They do an NIL deal with a bunch of teams across the country where they do autographed cards. And a pack like this of 6 cards for Georgia costs about $30. It has 6 autographed cards in it. You can actually buy the full team set. It runs about $500 for the full team for 87 players. And includes pretty much everybody on the whole team. Some of the other teams like Texas and Alabama, they don't have their full team. They've just got a limited selection of players. So if you buy their sets, you'll notice they might be a little bit cheaper. But for Georgia, they do have the full set of the full team. So we're going to be giving away cards. We'll talk more about it once we get to 100 subscribers, how you'll be eligible to win. And, and we'll kind of unbox them here on the show and announce the winners there. So if you haven't subscribed, please do and help us get to 100 subscribers.
Let's go. Let's do this. Let's get to 100 and beyond. All right, Big Ten. Was it a good year? Was it an okay year? Tell us about what happened in the Big Ten this year, Street.
Yeah, just like everybody else across the country, this was another year of expansion in the Big Ten. The Big Ten really went from being this conference that was mostly known as teams in the Midwest, a little bit out east, to being this national conference. They added 4 new schools out of the Pac-12 this year: Washington, Oregon, USC, and UCLA. It's just kind of crazy that they are truly that big national power conference that people have been thinking is coming, and it's going to continue to happen. Coming into this season, Michigan won the national championship last year, finally going undefeated, finally vanquishing all the schools from the SEC. Beating Ohio State. And so they were riding high, but Jim Harbaugh left, and everybody kind of thought there was going to be a step back there, and there was. Coming into the year, Ohio State was the favorite, obviously. Ton of talent, but also a big deal about how much money they spent acquiring talent through NIL and transfers this year. So they were the favorite coming in. And at the end of the year, it turned out that they won the national title. So all their plans worked out. But I think the big thing for this year, the Big Ten really flexed its muscles a little bit. The SEC kind of had a down year, and this first year of these big mega conferences, they kind of flexed their muscles and showed that, they have the money and they have the influence to grow. And they kind of put the SEC a little bit on notice that maybe the SEC's run of dominance might not be what it was. So it's kind of what we got going on in the Big Ten this year. Obviously, there were some new coaches this year. Curt Cignetti took over at Indiana. Sharon Moore took over at Michigan for Jim Harbaugh. Jed Fish was the new coach at Washington, replacing Kalen DeBoer, who went to Alabama. Deshaun Foster took over at UCLA, and Jonathan Smith took over at Michigan State. As for awards in the conference this year, the MVP and the Offensive Player of the Year went to Dylan Gabriel, the quarterback from Oregon, who just had a fantastic season.
Well deserved.
Defensive Player of the Year was Abdul Carter, defensive end from Penn State. Helped them make a deep run into the playoffs. Really an impressive player who will be a high draft pick in the draft. Coach of the Year, Curt Cignetti. I think this one was obvious, taking a team that was nothing to the playoffs. And the freshman of the year, who I think arguably is the best player in the country, Jeremiah Smith, wide receiver from Ohio State. Oregon was your conference champion, defeating Penn State. And then, of course, we had 14 teams from the Big Ten make the playoffs: Oregon, Penn State, Indiana, and, of course, Ohio State. So, Burrow, let's talk a little bit about how we're grading these teams.
Yeah. So, slight change to our grading system. We really put some more thought into how we wanted to do this. And so the way it's going to go is we're both going to give our gut feeling grades, like how we felt about how this team did based off whatever personal criteria. It doesn't matter. It's just our opinions. But then we're also going to throw in another tier, what we call a finish grade. And this grade is based off how they actually did throughout the season. So, for example, if you win the Natty, you get an A+. If you make the Natty, you get an A. Win a conference, make the playoff, A-, and just goes down from there. Gets into like 5 wins down to 1 win, A+ to F. So we take those 3 sets of grades, average them out to get the final grade, which we'll call our Nitro Show Math official grade conference grades. How's that sound?
Sounds great, man.
Cool. So we want to make it as convoluted as possible. No, I'm just kidding. So Oregon goes undefeated throughout the regular season, doesn't even make it to the Natty. Is it a good, successful season for Dan Lanning?
Yeah, I think so. Oregon last year in 2023 went 12-2 in their last year in the Pac-12. Both of their losses were to Washington, who ultimately played in the national championship game. And then, of course, this year they finish up at 13-1. Dan Lanning in his 3rd season has had nothing but success. To take this team, their first year in the Big Ten, they finished up, number 3 in the AP ranking, number 4 in the coaches poll. This season was a great year for them. Obviously, going undefeated is awesome, but also they get to hang their hat a little bit that they did beat Ohio State, who won the national championship in the regular season. And they also had a chance to knock off Washington, who was the team that beat them twice last year. And they defeated Michigan, who was the national champion last year. So I think those are 3, big hang your hat moments for them in their first year in the conference.
And they also beat Boise State in the second game of the season, which is a playoff team. So another big win there. Certainly from a wins-loss standpoint, they had a great season. Dylan Gabriel also great season, just all around. I believe it was one of the Heisman finalists. And in their first year in the Big Ten, ended up winning it.
Right. And that was a good game against a Penn State team that obviously went far in the playoffs too. At the end of the day, Ohio State had this great run to close the season, but Oregon had that all year long, beating solid teams, teams that were in the playoff, Boise State, Ohio State, Penn State, and just really, outclassing teams. They were a good mixture of teams, of players that had homegrown as well as transfers. And they were just very solid on both offense and defense. They were number 16 in the country in scoring offense and number 17 in scoring defense. So you don't get that much more balance than that.
Yeah, the only game that they really had any trouble with during the regular season was Wisconsin, going to Camp Randall, and they eked out that one 16-13.
At the end of the day, they just got beat by a team that had more talent in Ohio State. Very similar to a lot of these Alabama-Georgia games that you've seen over the last few years, where particularly in that 2021 season where Georgia lost that SEC championship game to Alabama, but when they played in the national championship game, the talent played up to its ability, and the team that was the better team at the end of the day won. So I think that's kind of what happened to Oregon here. They were just very good, but Ohio State was just a little bit better.
Yeah, great regular season, took care of business in the Big Ten championship game. They're outside of that Wisconsin game, their close games were their big games. Boise State, 3-point win. Ohio State, 1-point win. But the rest of the games, they pretty much dominated.
So for my grade for Oregon, first year in the Big Ten champion, undefeated regular season, lost in the quarterfinals of the playoffs. I'm going to give them an A- for this season. Earl, what'd you give them?
Yeah, I also went with an A- for similar reasons. First year in the Big Ten, they really stepped up their game compared to where they were the previous year. The competition that they're playing this year is better than what was in the old Pac 12, 16, now 2, whatever it is now. And, the Big Ten has like 19 teams or something stupid like that. Anyway, they had a really, really great year. They had a Heisman finalist. They won the Big Ten, made it to the playoff, had the bye, and unfortunately just couldn't pull it out against Ohio State that second time. And we all know how hard it is to beat a team twice in the same season. Georgia barely squeaked out against Texas in the SEC championship, and we saw that against Bama as well. So I go with the A- there for them. Great year. So their finish score, so they won their conference, they made the playoff. So that's a A- for their how they actually did during the season. So the final grade for the Oregon Ducks, according to the Nitro Show, is they get an A- for their 2024 campaign.
Just a great year for them, really. Super solid.
Whack.
All right. Up next, we have the Penn State Nittany Lions. Now, Penn State made it to the semifinals of the playoffs. Did that mean that James Franklin has finally lost his moniker as the Mark Richt of the Big Ten? What do you think, Burl?
Nah. No, he's still it. He's still it. They had a pretty easy path in the playoffs, so the whole notion around them finally winning a big game, I don't think that they have done that yet. They came really close against Notre Dame. It was a great game, but still couldn't pull it out. It was your typical James Franklin coach job, just doing great things and then nothing, and then crawling back at the very end to try to make it a close game.
In his 11th season at Penn State, which that's crazy to believe because I remember when he was at Vanderbilt. James Franklin, I mean, this is arguably the best team he's had at Penn State. They were 10-3 last year. They improved that record to 13-3 this year. They were close in the Big Ten championship game against Oregon. It was looking like it was going to be a blowout, but they certainly came back. Defense and running were the strengths. They had 2 awesome running backs that really were their go-to guys on offense. Drew Aller was solid, not spectacular, but their defense was great, very opportunistic. In the playoffs, got all those turnovers when they played their first playoff game. But at the end of the day, it's their inability to put teams away that kind of bit them a little bit. In their playoff games, they did jump out to big leads, but then kind of let their foot off the gas a little bit. And that's what happened when they played Notre Dame. They had a chance to, kind of take the lead and put that game away, and they didn't. So I still think at the end of the day, I like the comparison that James Franklin is the Mark Richt of the Big Ten. Next year will be his 12th year. Mark Richt lasted 15 seasons in Athens. So we'll see if he continues to stick around once they get to that 15th year. If they get there and they don't have a national title, at some point you got to say, is it ever going to really happen? And I don't know. But that being said, for their season they did have, making the semifinals of the playoffs, getting some big wins, but still not being able to beat Ohio State. I give them a grade of a B+.
They weren't able to beat Ohio State at home. And I think that was one of their whiteout games. You're right. Their team was absolutely stacked this year. That was by far one of the most talented rosters in college football. I mean, just watching them throughout the playoffs, they had the 2 running backs, like you said. Drew Aller was very good until the Notre Dame game. And the tight end, Tyler Warren, he is a beast. He's going to probably be right up there with Brock Bowers when he goes pro. Just same mentality, same type of player. And then on the defense, Abdul Carter. I mean, he's a beast. They just had a team full of beasts.
Yeah.
And a lot of high draft picks. But it just goes to show James Franklin, very, very, very similar to Mark Richt in his days at Georgia. All that being said, I mean, they still had a really, really solid year. The only game that really kind of stands out as kind of questionable is that Bowling Green game, 34-27. So that was a little weird for a home game.
But another very Mark Richt-like.
I was about to say, it's very Mark Richt-like. It's like Mark Richt versus UAB. I mean,
right. Or Marshall.
Or Marshall, yeah. So, yeah, very, very much the Mark Richt of the Big Ten. So, given, they made the playoff and had such a really good year and came really close to winning the Big Ten, I gave them a B+. That was a really, really solid year for Penn State. I think if you're a Penn State fan, you had a fun year until the end, obviously. But yeah, I give them a B+. As far as the finish grade goes, so since they made the playoff, that gets them a B+. So they were B+ all around. So Penn State's final grade for their 2024 season, according to the Nitro Show, is a B+.
Excellent. All right. Up next, we have the Indiana Hoosiers. The Indiana Hoosiers arguably had the best season in the history of their program. But is that good enough to get them an A grade? What do you think, bro?
I think you can throw out the word arguably. This was definitely their best season in their history. They have been the losingest team in all of college football.
Well, in the major conferences, at least.
Yeah, I don't care about the others. But yeah, I mean, great season for them. Just considering where they usually are. I mean, it seems like the past 5-10 years, they've been bordering on getting some big wins. When they had Michael Penix, they had some good wins. Their offense has always kind of shown sparks of being kind of dangerous. But this year they put it together, had help with a very, very winnable schedule. But
right.
Even though they had an easier schedule, they still took care of business. I mean, they won at Michigan in Ann Arbor against the defending national champs.
Right.
That's a huge win. I don't care who you are.
Right.
I mean,
keeping in mind, they had a very easy schedule last year too, and they went 3-9. This year they went 11-1. You can't ask for anything more, really, from the regular season than what Indiana did under Curt Cignetti in his first year. Coming over from James Madison, where he was super successful, he came over, he brought some transfers over from that program, and brought them the confidence they needed. Curt Cignetti is the ultimate confidence guy, sometimes to a fault, but they had, like you said, probably the best year in their school's history. They were only expected to win about 5.5 games, and Indiana coming into the season had never won more than 9 games in a season ever. They had the spotlight that they had been yearning for. They got to host College game day, and they defeated Washington in that game. They had the number 2 scoring offense in the country and the number 6 scoring defense. The rushing defense was statistically the best in the country, and they had 118 total tackles from Aiden Fisher leading that defense. And Curtis Rourke was solid at quarterback, 29 touchdowns, only 5 interceptions. Just an amazing season for the Hoosiers. Bloomington. They finished number 10 in the country. They ran into Notre Dame, who was just too strong and had too much depth that they didn't have. But what a great year for Indiana. You can't say much more. Now, I look at that, all of that. I mean, you can't give them an A+. They didn't win the national championship, but everything else considered, I gave them a solid A. I think this might be my highest graded team across the entire country because of what their past was and what this season was, making the playoffs. Just a great year for Indiana.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. Great season for Indiana. I mean, if you're an Indiana Hoosier football fan,
God bless you.
You had the best year ever. And who knows? Maybe they can keep going with it in this new age of NIL and transfer portal. They definitely have some personality with their coach, Kirk Cignetti. He is definitely a confident person. Although it was really, really funny before the Notre Dame game. He said they beat the shit out of, ranked teams or something like that, and then proceeded to lose, even though they hadn't beat a ranked team. So that was really funny. But regardless, Rourke was really, really solid this year. And even when he was injured, he still came in and played really well. So all around good year. I gave him an A-. Just, they did get beat by Ohio State, which, I mean, that's not really like a huge thing to hang your hat.
And they lost to Notre Dame, so they lost to the national championship. The national championship, so.
Yeah. So, good for them. Their finish grade, so since they made the playoff, they got a B+. So we average all that out. And the official grade for the Indiana Hoosiers in 2024 from the Nitro Show is a A-. So Ohio State wins the national championship this year, probably saves Ryan Day's job. So let's dive into it, see how their season went. So in 2023, they went 11-2. In 2024, they improved that, going 14-2. Of course, their final ranking was number 1, and they won the national championship. They did have some tough defeats. They lost at Oregon, really, really close game, 1-point game, in a weird ending where Will Howard, slid and time expired, and that was after Dan Lanning had put 12 guys on the field to defend a pass and got around the rule book, which was kind of brilliant. And then, the loss to Michigan was something to see. I mean, that was just a terrible game for Ohio State. Right. But they have the best roster in America this past year. They, spent a lot of NIL to keep a lot of their team in Columbus, but then they also did a really good job of adding talent in the transfer portal. Will Howard was a great pickup for them. There were questions about him throughout the year, but once they got into the playoffs, he was electric, and the Ohio State offensive line did what they needed to do to keep him clean, and that was everything for them. But then they also had they picked up Quinshon Judkins, arguably the best back in the SEC last year, and not to mention they picked up Caleb Downs on defense, who is arguably the best defensive player in America. Right. Added to an already stellar defense. I mean, their defense was off the charts, hands down best defense in college football this year. Number 1 scoring, number 1 total defense. It don't get much better than that.
Yeah. It doesn't get that much better than that, but it does. So here's this Ohio State team. When you look at the season as a whole and all the things that happened, it's really weird. This is a team that dominated in the playoffs, looked absolutely unbeatable, had all this talent, looked amazing. But 4 weeks before that, they thought their season was a failure and they were about to fire their coach. That they were totally an underachieving squad that was going to fire their coach, who has the highest or second highest winning percentage ever for a coach through his 5th season. It's just weird. They were so talented, and obviously that showed in the playoffs when they just beat the dog heck out of everybody. Yeah. But man, what was going on? Was it the adage that it was transfer players and they just didn't care? Was it coaching, what was it? Why were they not clicking as much as they should? And it just didn't make sense. When they got to the playoffs and they started beating people really bad, then it all made sense.
Yeah, it reminded me of those old LA Laker teams with Kobe and Shaq. They would start out slow and people would be like, what the heck's wrong with the Lakers? And then they just go on and beat the crap out of everybody.
Yeah. I mean, for an Ohio State team, the other thing is, yes, you won the national championship, but you lost to your rival. And your rival has beaten you 4 years in a row. Like, how proud are you of the season? Like, it's funny because as soon as this season ended, there was all these discussion online, a lot of Ohio State fans, this was the greatest team ever. Look what they had to do. Look at the teams they had to beat in the playoff. Well, this is a newsflash. This was the first year of the 12-team playoff. Going forward, any team who is in the playoff is at least going to have to beat 3 top-ranked teams to win a national championship. So the fact that they beat 4 straight highly ranked teams, that's awesome, and that's great for them, but that's going to be true of every national title team going forward. It's not some big accomplishment that makes them suddenly the best team in history. You lost 2 games, and you got your tail kicked against your rival, who was 6-5 coming into the game, and they beat the tails off you physically. So,
yeah,
when I look at this,
there's no way. People who are claiming that this is like the best team ever can go kick rocks. So it's like, that's dumb. That is a dumb take, because you can look at a lot of different teams. I mean, over the past 10 years, that's usually who people are comparing against. The 2021, 22 Georgia teams, the Joe Burrow LSU team. That, in my mind, is the best team ever. Like that schedule that they had was legit, and they beat the brakes off everybody.
Right.
There was not ever a doubt that LSU was going to lose. Like, everybody knew that they were going to win going into just about every game. And then look at those old USC teams with Reggie Bush and Matt Leinart. I mean, those were awesome teams. I mean, they were just stacked full of dudes. So not even in the same stratosphere.
Yeah. So when it comes to giving this Ohio State team a grade, I mean, national champion, obviously most talented team in the country, you would think, they're going to get an A+. But that loss to Michigan, the loss to Oregon by 1 point on the road, that you can forgive. But that loss to Michigan is going to stick out throughout the history books. No matter what, they lost to Michigan and got their tail kicked. And in any other season, that would have cost them the playoff. It didn't this year because it's the first team in the 12-team playoff. So for that being said, I'm going to give them a grade of an A. I can't go any lower than that, but I certainly can't go any higher.
Yeah, because they lost to Michigan in the way that they lost to Michigan, and also considering the fact that this was not a very good Michigan team. Ohio State loses to them at home in Columbus. It's not like they went on the road and played in a hostile environment and somehow came up short. No, this was by far one of the worst Michigan teams that we've seen in a long time. They had zero semblance of a pass game. They could run the ball. They could play defense. That they're really good at. But the simple fact that Ohio State lost to them at home, I gave them an A-, even though they won the national championship. That regular season was just so weird.
Right.
It wasn't an A or A+ total season.
Right.
To me.
So based on our finish criteria, they won the national championship. So they get an A+ there. Averaged out, the final Nitro Show grade for Ohio State in 2024 is an A.
Brett Bielema, is this his best coaching job in his career? I personally think so. With Illinois, they get 10 wins for the first time in a while and end up having a pretty decent season. We're really close to, competing for the Big Ten championship, and got some big wins along the way.
Yeah, this year's Illinois team is really interesting. They were only 5-7 last year. Finished up 10-3 this year with a huge win in their bowl game over a hot South Carolina team. They finished number 16 in the country. This was Brett Bielema's 4th season up there with Illinois. And as you said, this was probably his best coaching job. The expectations were pretty low coming into the season. There were a lot of good teams joining the conference this year, and you didn't expect that Illinois was going to finish, in the top of the conference. But they ultimately, finished up there around, about the 5th team in the conference. They got a solid year from Luke Altmaier coming in from Ole Miss. But overall, their offense really wasn't that good. This was more of a defensive football team. They were only 97th in the country in total offense, but 31st in scoring defense. But, like I said, for Bielema, this was Illinois' first 10-win season since 2001. And it was their first 9-win season since 2007. And so if you look back, you think about, what was that, 2007 season? That was Ron Zook, Juice Williams playing quarterback, Aurelius Ben playing wide receiver. Names you haven't thought about in a long time, right?
That's a name I haven't heard in a long time.
Right. And if you think back to that 2001 season, that's Kurt Kittner at quarterback.
Oh,
There's
man.
a name you haven't heard in a long time.
Gosh.
So it's been a long time since Illinois has, had this successful a season. And like I said, it wrapped up really great. South Carolina was one of the hottest teams in the country coming into that bowl game. And they had a guy or two that didn't play, but for the most part, they had their full team ready to go in that bowl game. And, there was tension and tempers got hot between the two coaches. And
that was awesome, by the way. That was
Illinois got the win. So, I mean, that was a great job for them.
That was hilarious watching Bielema and South Carolina Beaver going at it. That was so funny, especially afterwards, because it just continued.
Right. Right. It did.
That was fantastic. Yeah, great season. Great win at the end of the season. Another win over the SEC by the Big Ten. So a lot of, pom-pom waving around that. So congrats to the Big Ten on that one. But yeah, I thought they had a really, really solid year, and I gave them a B+. I thought it was just a really good year.
Yeah, I gave them an A-. I mean, I thought it was a great year, especially when I saw that stat about the first 10-win season in 24 years. I thought, heck, I don't know how you can expect much better than that. So I gave them an A-. Based on our finish criteria, they got a B-, which kind of feels kind of low. But we averaged that out, all the scores. The Nitro Show final grade for Illinois in 2024 is a B.
Very nice. Very nice.
All
the
right.
champagne of football teams.
All right. Up next, we have the Iowa Hawkeyes coming off a 10-4 season in 2023. And, this was Kirk Ferentz's 26th season in Iowa. I think he's the longest tenured coach in all of D1. 26 years. That's crazy. They didn't finish ranked this year. They only went 8-5, which for them in recent years, that's kind of a letdown. And this was a little bit different of an Iowa team than what you've seen. In recent years, Iowa's kind of been the butt of the joke, right? They play great defense and they punt.
Yeah, punting is winning.
Right. Punting is winning, super low scoring games and everything. They still had a pretty strong defense this year, but not quite as good as the last few years. They averaged 17.8 points per game, which for most people, that's amazing. But for Iowa, where they've been producing defensive backs and Cooper DeJean returning a touchdown.
They were definitely missing Cooper DeJean. Right.
They did improve on offense this year. They were 72nd in the country in scoring, which you're like, 72nd, but last year, they scored 15 points a game. So
yeah,
it's better, but they still weren't a great offense. They were in in the hundreds overall for total offense. So scoring was a little bit better than actually moving the ball. But the problem with them was failing to close out close games. They had close games against Iowa State, UCLA, and Missouri, and they lost them all. you win those games and suddenly you're a team that with great defense, you would have been in the conversation for the playoff because you'd have been 10-2. You probably wouldn't have made it, but you might have been in the discussion. The real bright spot for this year's Iowa's team was Kalen Johnson at running back. The guy ran for 1,500 yards. And when you have a team that really has no passing attack whatsoever, I think they only had like 2,000 yards passing as a team. Having a running back who other teams know is the only real offense they've got, move the ball that well, that's quite an accomplishment.
Yeah, it's definitely a down year for just looking through some of their games. I mean, they got blown out by Ohio State. They lost to Michigan State.
That's not good.
That's not good. So this was not a very strong Iowa team. Definitely seems like it seems like they're on a downward trend, in my opinion, right now, especially with the way the Big Ten has shifted, with Pac-12 teams coming in and, all the coast-to-coast stuff. Could be red herring, but I don't know. It just seems like if there was a team that would suffer from that, it seems like it'd be Iowa. But who knows? I mean, Kurt Ferentz has been there 26 years for a reason, so they might be able to turn around next year. But in terms of their, normal, what they expect, they definitely didn't meet their expectations. I mean, they're usually a solid 10-win team, regardless of the year.
Or their inability to play offense.
I mean, they usually have like a really solid tight end, right? I mean,
yeah, they put some tight ends in the NFL.
Yeah, so I mean, they could at least do that. But I mean, I couldn't really name a player on their team. Maybe the quarterback who used to play for Michigan. I still can't remember.
Yeah.
Anyway, so all that being said, since it wasn't really a great year for Iowa, especially by their standards, I ended up giving them a C+.
Yeah. I gave them a B, just because they showed some improvement on offense a little bit, and they'd been so bad the last few years, especially scoring-wise, that I kind of felt like that was a plus. Like maybe they were trying to change some things, maybe trying to get better and not just be this great defensive team. So I gave them a B.
Yeah, maybe they should have just kept that strength on defense.
I mean, yeah. I mean, their defense was still really good.
Oh, I know.
Just not quite the craziness they've had. But, just based on the finish grade, they get a B- for having a winning season and being bowl eligible. With that being said, averaged all together, the Nitro Show grade for the Iowa Hawkeyes in 2024 is a B-.
Okay. So, down year for Michigan. I don't think there's any other way around it. Tell us about it.
Yeah. What was it not being able to cheat anymore? It made Michigan as bad.
The Connor Stallions factor.
Right. This is another interesting team to talk about. Obviously, Michigan had really built towards that 2023 season. They made the playoffs in 2021. They made the playoffs in 2022. And then they finally won the national championship last year, getting over that hump that they'd had. Michigan hadn't won a national championship since 1997. So it'd been a long time for them. But of course,
yeah. And their whole motto was beat Georgia.
Right. But I mean, you get to a point, you have to build your program and you build up and you have these great runs, and then inevitably you have some drop off. Not everybody's Alabama. Not everybody's Alabama under Nick Saban anyway. I mean, even Georgia has struggled a little bit after its 2 titles. So Jim Harbaugh, of course, left to go to the NFL. And then that left you with Sherrone Moore taking over his first season. And coming off a national championship, Michigan did not finish ranked this year. It was a disappointing season, obviously. They were not the team that they've been the last few years. And for lots of their fans, that sucked, But But if you have to look at the season, really how it went, and if you look at how the season ended, you kind of have to be encouraged for Michigan. Because coming into the year, new coach, they were still expected to be great. They've got some top 10, top 15 draft pick level guys on defense. Donovan Edwards was expected to be a star at the running back position. Hell, he was on the college football video game. He ended up being hurt and not playing a ton, not having a great year. Khalil Mullings ended up having a much better season.
Did he get cursed by the cover?
I mean, him and Ewers were both on it, and Ewers had kind of a disappointing season, though Texas was okay, and he stayed good. But like I said, you really have to look at the end of this season to look at how this season was for Michigan. As a defending national championship, this season sucked. But finishing 8-5, beating your rival, Ohio State, when they went on to win the national championship, and then beating Alabama in the bowl game, an Alabama team that struggled throughout the year, that was down and maybe didn't want to be there. They wanted to be there, and they beat them. And they made Alabama look bad. So finishing up at 8-5 with a bowl win, and then they've got the number one player recruit in the country coming in to play quarterback next year. You know, they still had good players this year. They just didn't have a great season. You kind of got to look at this season as a building year, even though coming off a national championship, that's weird to say, but that's what it was. So I think there's a lot to look forward to next year in Ann Arbor. That being said, obviously it's a disappointment when you're coming off a national title to go 8-5. It just is. I gave them a grade of a B- for this season. How about you, Burl?
Yeah, definitely a disappointing season for Michigan. Getting blown out by Texas at home, and then, losing at Washington, to a Washington team that's not great either. And they lost to Illinois, and then of course Indiana and Oregon. So yeah, by any measure of Michigan's history, this would be a down year. This would be a bad year for Michigan. The saving grace that they do have is that they did beat Ohio State. Huge win. And also the win over Bama is really, really big. Another victory for the Big Ten over the SEC this year. So there's your bragging rights. But anyway, this was a team that, if they had a passing game, they could have been extremely dangerous. They were able to run the ball very effectively this year, even with the injuries to Edwards. They were able to play really, really good defense, with the exception of that Texas game. And they put those two things together pretty well for the Ohio State game. And I think they found some semblance of a passing game with the walk-on who was there, which that was a great story too, for that Ohio State game. You've got a Michigan guy, been a Michigan fan his whole life. He's a walk-on, and he gets to go in and beat Ohio State.
And he was a cancer survivor too.
And a cancer survivor. Like how did I forget that? Like that's even bigger.
Yeah.
So, great ending to a season for them. Absolutely, they should be pumped and looking forward to next year. If the number one QB coming in as a freshman can provide halfway decent passing game, look out for Michigan next year. They're going to be very, very dangerous, and I would not be shocked if they won the Big Ten next year. But
absolutely,
this year, not a good year. 5 losses. That's a lot for Michigan, given their history and coming off a national championship. I had to give them a C+. It was just a crap year.
Yeah. So based on our criteria for finishing grade, they got a B- for having a winning season and going to a bowl game. So the final overall score, the Nitro Show final score for the Michigan Wolverines in 2024 is a C+.
C+ for those Wolverines.
Yeah. All right. Up next, we have the Minnesota Golden Gophers rowing the boat under PJ Fleck in his 7th season. In 2023, they were 6-7. Were bowl eligible, of course, lost their bowl game. And then in 2024, they improved that record. They went 8-5 this year, and they won their bowl game. They got off to a slow start. They started out 2-3, and then they got hot and they won 4 in a row, including a couple of ranked wins. They beat USC, who was ranked at the time, ended up not being very good. And they also beat Illinois, who we talked about earlier, really had a great season. I think the biggest issue for Minnesota this year was that they were really bad on offense. They were really, really good on defense, but they were really, really bad on offense. They were the 5th overall defense in the country. Where do you think they finished in total offense?
How many teams are there in the college football?
About 130.
130.
They were 107th in total offense. So that's 107. So quite a disparity. They had 3 losses that were by 3 points or less, and that was to UNC, Michigan, and Penn State. So 3, pretty solid teams that they had a chance to win, but they just couldn't get it done. And they also had a 1-point loss to Penn State late in the season. And they had a chance to get the ball back, but Penn State ran a fake punt, and it led to Penn State running the clock out. And so ultimately Penn State ended up winning that game and going on to the Big Ten championship game. And then they closed out the year with a bowl win over Virginia Tech. So it was their 12th bowl appearance in the last 14 years, which I was amazed. I was like, Minnesota is the team that makes the bowl game every year, but I found that out. But, just another year.
Minnesota's the team that is the only team to win 3 national titles in a row. I mean,
very true. It was the 1930s, but another solid year for Minnesota. PJ Fleck is a good coach. I know people joke him because he's over anxious and the road the bloat thing and all that, but I think he's a pretty good coach. So, good year for Minnesota. I give him a B+. Burl, what did you think about Minnesota this year?
Yeah, I like PJ Fleck a lot too. I'm surprised he's still there, frankly, because I do think he's a pretty good coach. I mean, he's gotten Minnesota to be competitive over this past 7 seasons, and yeah, that's a shocking stat. 12 bowl appearances in the last 14. I did not know that. So
yeah, it surprised me. I was like, you expect your good programs to have that, but I didn't expect Minnesota to be one, because you just kind of feel like Minnesota is always kind of that middle of the road Big Ten team, right? Like they don't win the conference, but you just kind of assume that everybody else that's not winning the conference is occasionally having a bad year. But for Minnesota, they really don't.
Yeah. So all that being said, and given the fact that they improved from the season before, I gave them a B. So their finish grade, since they had a winning season, they made a bowl game, that gets them a B-. And so the final grade for your Minnesota Golden Gophers 2024 season is a B.
Go Gophers.
Gophers.
Up next, and this one's going to be an interesting one. How does Lincoln Riley get worse and worse each season as a coach? Because this year at USC, in their first year in the Big Ten, USC only went 7-6. They've gotten worse in the years he was at Oklahoma, and then the years he's been at USC. They seem to have gotten worse almost every single season.
Yeah, maybe he's just one of those. Happen? Maybe he's one of those guys that's just a better coordinator than a head coach.
Maybe.
I mean, we don't really know. I mean,
he's had 3 Heisman Trophy winners.
That doesn't mean he's a good head coach.
True.
That means he's a really good quarterback coach.
True. So, I mean, this is his 3rd season at USC since he left Oklahoma and kind of raided their program. This year, he didn't have the luxury of having a Heisman-level quarterback that he's had almost his entire career. He went from Baker Mayfield to Kyler Murray to Spencer Rattler before he kind of fell off to Caleb Williams. And then this year, what do you have? Miles Miller? Was that his quarterback? Just wasn't the same.
I thought it was Moss. Something Moss, right?
Miller Moss. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Miller Moss. I knew it was something like that.
Yeah. It's interesting. So looking back, when he was at Oklahoma, he didn't have to build that program. It was there for him, basically.
Right. Bob Stoops left the cupboard full for him when he retired.
He absolutely did. Now him going to USC, now he's got to build a program because USC has been kind of down for the past decade. And I don't see him being that program builder. I mean, he hasn't proven it.
They lost a lot of transfers after this season too.
And that's a bad sign.
Yeah. A lot of big time, multiple 5-star guys that left, including Branch coming to Georgia. Like, it was not a good year for Lincoln Riley. They had 4 bad losses in the middle of the season to weak teams, and arguably their best win in the whole season was against Rutgers, and maybe you could say LSU. They opened the year, they beat LSU in that first game of the season, but we talked about LSU was kind of down for LSU standards this year as well. So their best win of the season was against Rutgers. Like, that's not what you expect at USC. And then the other thing that you always expect for a Lincoln Riley team was offense. They just score like crazy. They were 51st in the country in scoring this year. They only scored 40 points twice all season. For his past offenses where he had these Heisman Trophy winners and he had these offenses at Oklahoma that they scored 50 points a game, they only scored 40 twice. That's not characteristic of a program headed in the right direction.
They had moments where their offense looked really, really good. The game against Notre Dame comes to mind. They were able to throw the ball all over the place, and Notre Dame's got a really good defense. They had a good bowl victory over A&M, so they actually had 2 wins over SEC teams this year. So that's another
continues that trend.
Another Big Ten wins again.
Big Ten's winning again a lot.
Yeah. Big Ten's having a good year. But for USC, given their traditional standards of being a team that's competing for national titles, this was definitely not a good year. And the fact that they did worse than the year before is a huge indictment on Lincoln Riley. Couple that with all the transfers leaving, I thought it was a bad season, so I gave him a C.
You're generous. I thought it was a really bad season. I thought all the trends are in the wrong way. They weren't as good as on offense as they'd been. This was their first year in the Big Ten, and they were expected to be one of these prized gets for the Big Ten coming in, from the West Coast. It was originally just them and UCLA, not Oregon and Washington coming in. So this was supposed to be a big deal, them coming to the Big Ten and all these teams that getting to play all these teams that they had, would only get to play in the Rose Bowl and things like that. I just thought it was a really bad year for them. I gave them a D+. I thought this was a bad year for USC.
Wow. Is this the first or second time that you've given someone a lower grade than me?
It might be. But like I said, it's totally based around expectations and the continued decline of Lincoln Riley.
Yes. Yeah. Not a good season. As far as the finished grade goes, they did have a winning season and they made a bowl game. So that gets them a B- there. So we average that out. And your Nitro Show final grade for the USC Trojans 2024 football season is a C. C's get degrees.
All right. Up next, we have Tony Soprano's favorite team, the Scarlet Knights of Rutgers, New Jersey University. Fifth season under Greg Schiano after, 5th year after he didn't leave to go take the Tennessee job.
You going to Rutgers, right?
They were 7-6 last year. They went 7-6 again this year. They didn't finish ranked, at 7-6, obviously. This was a team when I really looked into how their season went, they had a ton of injuries, and that really showed up. They started off well, but in the middle of the season, they had 4 straight losses, and that was compounded with a lot of injuries. It just kind of derailed their season from what was looking to be kind of a strong year early on. This was their first time to make back-to-back bowl games in 10 years. So, there are some positives there. And they did close out the season strong. Like I said, the middle of the season was kind of tough with injuries, but they had a strong win over Michigan State to close the year. They did lose their bowl game to Kansas State. But 7-6 for Rutgers, another bowl season, was pretty good. It's kind of like they played 3 seasons. They started off really well. They had struggles in the middle of the year, and then they kind of won some games at the end before they lost their bowl game. So I think this was a pretty good year for them continuing forward. I've never really understood that Rutgers isn't a better football team than they are. They're in New Jersey.
The birthplace of college football.
Right. But I mean, you got to think that there's lots of people up there in the Northeast that like football, and you just don't, you don't see Rutgers or Syracuse ever being dominant teams. And it's just something I just have never really understood. But
no, Sean Moreno's from New Jersey.
Very, very true. But anyway, that being said, I gave them a grade of a C+. Solid season, another bowl year, but that's all I can give them.
Yeah. A solid year. I mean, the expectations at Rutgers are not going to be high. They did have a tough stretch there in the middle of the season. But they play in Piscataway, New Jersey, so I'm going to give them a B just for that. Their finishing grade, so they had a winning season. They were bowl eligible. They get a B- there. And average all that together, the Nitro Show final grade for your Rutgers Scarlet Knights 2024 football season is a B.
All right. Up next, we have the Washington Huskies, the defending runner-up in 2023. When they went 14-1, they were the Pac-12 champion in the last full year the Pac-12 played in the national championship game that they ultimately lost to Michigan. Coming into the Big Ten this year, they had expectations of still being a good program despite losing Kalen DeBoer to Alabama. Jed Fish took over as coach his first season. Not a great year for Washington. They went 6-7, 6-6 regular season, lost their bowl game. Overall kind of disappointing following a national title game appearance. They kind of felt like Washington has, in the past has some history. They've won a national championship before, and last year kind of felt like a year, hey, maybe they're putting it back together to be a team that can kind of run and be an upper echelon program in their new conference. And it just didn't happen. Losing DeBoer, I think, hurt a lot. He had really built something good there, and he left. He took some of his players, he took some of his coaches, and it just wasn't the same. Now, going into the year, they weren't projected to be a crazy good team. Most of the projections had them around 6.5 wins. So they finished at 6-7. So they kind of met projected expectations from Vegas anyway, but it was just a very up and down year. They kind of would win one, lose one, win one, lose one all year round. And they just went from having a high-powered offense to one that didn't score more than 35 points all year. So,
yeah, it's just kind of a meh year, coming off of a national championship season. You kind of expected there to be a drop-off when you lose your coach after, especially a national championship year. So I kind of felt for Washington just because they had so much loss and turnover, and then, now they're going into a new conference, and they had a pretty decently tough schedule. I mean, they had to play at Indiana and Penn State and Oregon, And those are just not a easy task there. So I ended up just giving them a C, just because it was just a meh kind of season.
Yeah. I gave them a C plus strictly on the fact that they did get to avenge the national championship game loss and they beat Michigan. So that bumped me up from a C to a C plus. Just based on our criteria for their final grade, they got a C plus because they were bowl eligible. However, they finished with a losing record. And that being said, the Nitro Show final grade for the Washington Huskies in 2024 is a C. We have another new team to the conference, the UCLA Bruins, coming off an 8-5 season. UCLA was feeling pretty good about itself in its first season under Deshaun Foster. But 2024 was not a good season for UCLA. They finished 5-7, missed a bowl game, obviously didn't finish ranked. And it really started out horribly. They were 1-5 to start the season. They were able to, salvage 4 wins down the second half of the season, but they just had tough losses all over the place. Indiana, Oregon, Penn State. They just were never able to recover with decent wins. They got a few wins. They did beat Nebraska and Iowa, two bowl teams, but their biggest issue this year was they just couldn't score. They scored 18.4 points per game, which was good for 126th in the country. And like we said before, there's only about 130 some odd teams in the country. So when you're finishing that low, they managed to win 5 games, maybe saying something good. But this just wasn't the start that they wanted to have in the conference, especially coming off a good year last year. This just wasn't a good start for them.
Yeah. This is a team that I wish was good. I don't know why, but I used to on old NCAA college football. I'd play with UCLA when I needed to take a break from, Georgia Dynasty and see what I could do there. So I've just always kind of liked UCLA. So I hope they can get good one day. I mean, they do play in the Rose Bowl. That's pretty cool.
Yeah,
seems like
Georgia was supposed to be opening the season out there. 2025.
That would have been awesome.
That was supposed to be the first game of the season, and all this conference realignment crap canceled it. So now we get to host Marshall at home. Boo!
Look out for Marshall.
Look out for Marshall.
Mark Richt's not allowed to go to that game.
No.
But yeah, not much to say about UCLA. I mean, just a bad year. I gave them a D plus.
Yeah, I gave them a C, strictly on the fact that they did start 1-5, but they were able to recover and go 4-2 down the stretch, including those 2 wins over bowl teams.
They did beat Rutgers.
They did. Well, that's good. So they had three bowl team wins then. But it was just not a great year. So I gave them a C. The final grade based on having 5 wins in our grading style gives them a C. And so for 2024, the Nitro Show grade for the UCLA Bruins is a C minus.
All right. So Nebraska gets a new quarterback to start the year. They look really, really hot, but then it gets cold and they drop a whole bunch of games. What happened with Nebraska this year, Street?
Dylan Raiola became Dylan Raiola and became a lot less Patrick Mahomes is what happened. Because all year long, people have said they looked like each other, and Nebraska got out to a hot start. They opened up 5-1. They blew out everybody's darling Colorado early in the season, and they were 5-1, and then they lost 5 straight games. And they lost all 3 games that they had against ranked teams in the conference. When they played Colorado, Colorado was unranked. So
yep. Nebraska's got to be the Texas A&M of the Big Ten.
Yeah, except that Nebraska probably has more history, and they haven't been as good recently. This was their first time making a bowl game in 7 years, which I thought, for a program like Nebraska, that's crazy, considering the following and the money that they've had and the history that they've had. A 7-season bowl drought is really long. But like I said, they did make a bowl game, and they did win their bowl game. They beat Boston College. So there's a lot of good things to look forward to, I think, out there at Nebraska. Raiola, he started all year, and he was a freshman quarterback. He had the ups and downs you expect. They finished 94th in offense, so that kind of speaks a little bit to having a freshman quarterback. But their defense was really strong. Maybe that was kind of the, stepping back up of the black shirt defense. They were 18th in the country in total defense. So there's a lot to like there. I like Matt Rule as a coach. I think he didn't really get a fair shake in the NFL. He did a good job when he was at Baylor before that. So Nebraska 7-6 this year. And a lot to build on. They've got some high profile transfers coming in next year. Two big time transfer receivers. Elijah Pritchett, the offensive tackle from Alabama, is coming in. Williams Nwarny, 5-star from Missouri, is coming in. So they went and spent money in the offseason on transfers. So a lot to look forward to for Nebraska. As for the 2024 season, I gave them a B- simply on the fact that they ended that bowl drought. They're headed in the right direction. Burr, what'd you think about Nebraska?
Yeah, I mean, given the fact that they improved their record from the previous year, I agree with you. I think Matt Rule is a really good coach, especially at the college level. I mean, he has his teams bought in. That's one thing he's really, really great at. Dylan Raiola, having a freshman quarterback is always going to be tough. And even though, had that, a stretch of 5 or 4 losses in a row, 5 losses in a row, it's still experience that he's able to gain. Very highly talented quarterback coming out of high school. I mean, we all know the story. He was committed to Georgia and then flipped at the last minute. He's got family ties there to Nebraska. So I was actually a little more generous this time. So this might be the third where I gave him a grade a little higher than yours. So I gave him a B just because they did improve from the previous year. And it looks like they're building some momentum moving forward. So their finish grade, given that they did have a winning season and they were bowl eligible, that gets them a B-. And so your final grade from the Nitro Show for your Nebraska Cornhuskers in 2024 is a B-.
All right. Up next, we have the Michigan State Spartans, coached by Jonathan Smith in his first season. Michigan State is coming off a 4-8 year, kind of riddled with controversy. The mess that was left by the Mel Tucker situation had kind of torn them down. But people forget that Michigan State has made the college football playoff before, which is kind of weird to say because of what they've been the last few years. They did manage to go 5-7 this year, so that was an improvement. Their highlight win of the season was a 32-20 defeat of Iowa. But it was just another underwhelming year for them in East Lansing. Just, they went 5-7, which is about what they were projected to do. They didn't really have a lot go great, but they didn't have too much go really bad either. This was their third straight losing season. After an 11-win season in 2021 that got Mel Tucker a huge contract that ultimately they had to rip up and get out of that mess. They had a quarterback, Aiden Childs, who showed some flashes this year, and he'll be back next year. But he threw 11 picks and he only had 13 touchdowns, so he'll need to improve a lot for them to get better next year. And their defense just wasn't very good. They gave up 31-plus points in 7 games this year. So, like I said, just a very, very mediocre season for Michigan State. I gave them a C+ because they did improve their record from last year. But what are your thoughts on Michigan State?
Yeah, I mean, coming off the Mel Tucker situation, that's really tough to rebound from. And simply because of that, and they did improve their record from the previous season, I gave them a B.
Wow.
Seemed like a just a, better than expected season than they thought that they were going to have.
Wow. That surprises me because that's high for you, man.
That is high for me. Yeah, so their finish grade, since they won 5 games, that gets them a C for that. So their final Nitro Show grade for Michigan State Spartans, go Sparty. Props to Nitro. Kevin, it's for you. They get a C+.
All right. Up next, we have the Wisconsin Badgers, who got the crap beat out of them by Alabama at home and managed to go 5-7 this year after going 7-6 in 2023. This was Luke Fickell's 3rd year in Wisconsin, and so far, the Luke Fickell administration, for lack of a better term, up there in Madison has not been what the expectations were. Luke Fickell took Cincinnati to the playoff, and when they brought him in, they thought that he was going to come in and kind of at least carry on what they'd been doing in Wisconsin, which was being a solid 8-9 win team every year. And it just hasn't worked out for them. They started out 5-2 this year, but then they lost 5 straight to end the season. And 4 of those 5 games were by more than 14 points. So they were losing, but they were losing bad too. They lost to every ranked team on their schedule, including that butt whipping that they took from Alabama. And that game was really, really the point in the season, that everything kind of fell off. Tyler Van Dyke got hurt. He was the transfer quarterback from Miami that they thought was going to be this great player who came in, and he got hurt and ended up missing most of the season. They did play some close games against Penn State and Oregon, but they just weren't very good. They were 99th in total offense, 40th in total defense, and just not characteristic with what Wisconsin has been in the past, which is a team that can run the ever-living dog crap out of the ball and play great defense and consistently win 10 games. And they haven't done that since 2019. So,
yeah. And outside of Russell Wilson, I swear they've had the same quarterback at Wisconsin every year. Definitely not a good year for Wisconsin. That is kind of crazy to think that Luke Fickell took Cincinnati to the playoff and is doing so poorly at Wisconsin. But I mean, we've seen that other from other coaches too.
He went to the playoffs with Desmond Ridder as quarterback. That's even more amazing.
Wild. And he got beat by Georgia.
Well, that was the year before that. He got beat by Alabama in the playoff.
Oh, that's true. That's true. So yeah, overall, I mean, I gave him a C, and I think that was just being generous.
Yeah, I gave them a C-. Like I said, this is not up to Wisconsin's standard. Wisconsin has not been a perennial national title contender, but they used to be a team that would win 8, 9, 10 games every year.
Yeah,
and they haven't been that for 5 years.
And they usually put out a solid running back each year too. I mean, we've seen a lot of good running backs come out of Wisconsin.
Yep. So I gave them a C-. Their finish grade, because they won 5 games, gives them a C. So in 2024, the Nitro Show grade for the Wisconsin Badgers is a C-.
So, kind of shocked. Northwestern didn't finish last.
Oh. Heck, they didn't even finish second to last.
It's kind of wild for them, considering, they lost their coach, a year ago? And
yeah, I mean, before we get into their 2024 season, let's talk about their 2023. Pat Fitzgerald, who was like the stalwart of their coach that had taken them to the Big Ten championship a few times, gets fired after all this crazy hazing stuff comes out. And somehow that team recovered and went 8-5. They fired the coach in the season. There was discourse in the locker room. That, just crazy that they went 8-5 last year. David Braun, who took over in the season last year, was the coach again this year, his second season, and they went from 8-5 to 4-8, and it was really bad. This was not a good year for Northwestern. They won 2 games in conference, and it was against the 2 teams that finished after them in Purdue and Maryland. They just were really bad on offense. I think that is what it boiled down to. They scored 10 or less points in 7 games this season. Their 7 conference losses were all by multiple. Just really bad, except for when they played Maryland and Purdue, 2 teams that went a combined 1-17 in the Big Ten this year. So
Powerhouses.
Yeah. So not really a lot to say in the positive for Northwestern this year. After you just said last year was a huge positive after the crap that happened,
For me, I mean, the expectations at Northwestern are not there. They're 0 expectations. So I feel like any win that they get is a big victory for them in the long run. They don't get a lot of them, especially this year. So I was a little more generous than you. I went with a C-, just because they're coming off of all that turmoil. I know they went 8-5 last year, but still, whenever you replace a coach who's done a good job, but then gets replaced unexpectedly, that's going to disrupt the program a lot. So I give him a C-.
Yeah, I wasn't as generous. I gave him a D. I thought it was a bad year. Their finish grade, based on our rules, they get a C-. So the final grade for the Northwestern Wildcats in 2024 is a D+. Just not a good year.
Nope, not at all. Not at all.
Up next, we have the Maryland Terrapins, 6th season under Coach Mike Locksley, who's been a pretty good coach for them, and they've had some good years. I think their expectations were fairly high coming into this year. They were 8-5 last year, and they had a few solid bowl seasons under Locksley since 2019, but this year was just really, really bad. Like, they were bad on offense, 102 in scoring, bad on defense, 105th. And it's weird because the season started off really good. The first game of the year, they played UConn, who actually ended up winning like 9 or 10 games this year, and they beat them 50-7. And then what happened?
Yeah, exactly.
They
lose to Michigan State the next week.
Yeah, but they scored 50 points in that game. They only scored more than 30 points once the rest of the entire season, and that was against Villanova, who's an FCS school. Like, what happened in that first game? And they just fell off.
How are they like the opposite of Oregon?
Yeah, I don't know.
They're supposed to be the Oregon of the East Coast with the whole Under Armour thing,
right?
And
yeah,
and they're just not.
No, I mean, honestly, the only really bright spot they had was Ty Felton, their receiver, who had 96 catches, which was good for 4th in the country. But they lost 7 of their 8 last games, all by at least 2 scores. Like, just bad. It definitely the worst year under Mike Locksley since 2019. So for that, I gave him a D-. I thought this was a mitigated disaster for Maryland this year.
Wow, they beat USC.
Well, we know my opinion on USC. They were a D as well.
I know. But I mean, given how bad the Maryland season was, and you see win over USC.
They got to win over USC, and like I said, UConn, who ended up being really good. So
they beat Villanova, who's number 5 in the FCS. I mean, something. I gave him a D- too. Just I don't understand why Maryland's this bad at football. I thought crab cakes and football is what they do. Their finish grade, so since they got 4 wins, that gives them a C-.
Yeah, and averaged out their final grade for the 2024 season was a D. All right, so we're down to the last program in the Big Ten, and my God, was this football team bad in 2024. the Purdue Boilermakers, who were 4-8 in 2023. In 2024, they went 1-11. Coach Ryan Walters, it was his second year. He got fired after the season. I think he was the only coach in the Big Ten that got fired this year. This season was just absolutely abysmal. Their one win was over Indiana State. They were 129th in scoring offense and 131st. Yeah, and 131st in scoring defense. So they were really freaking bad on offense and really freaking bad on defense. No, their schedule was hard. They had to play all 4 of the teams out of the Big Ten that made the playoffs. They lost those 4 games by a combined score of 195-10. Like,
Jeez.
That's really, really bad. Basically, those games, they lost by almost an average of 50-2, basically.
Wow. Yeah, this is one of the worst teams in the entire country. I mean, just bad. Nothing good to say about them, other than Drew Brees is their alumni.
Yeah. I mean, this is the worst team in the country this year. There's no doubt about it. Like, there's no, at least in the Power 4 conferences, this is the worst team in the country. They were that bad. The only thing they have to look forward to is they hired Barry Odom to be their coach next year. And, I liked him when he was the coach at Missouri. He's a good defensive guy. Maybe he can set them right, because Purdue, used to be this team that wasn't always that great, but they were good for one crazy upset a year.
Yeah.
Ohio State or Michigan or somebody, they would always upset somebody. But that was not this team this year. They were just the team that everybody came to kick the crap out of. So that's what happened.
Yeah.
So I gave them an F. Like I said, this season was horrible for them.
Yeah, it always seems like Purdue has like one really, really good player, each year. But obviously this year is not one of those years. I also gave them an F. Just
All right,
a complete
so
failure of a season.
their finish grade, because they did get a win, is a D-. But that being said, the Purdue Boilermakers in 2024 get a final grade of an F. Good luck in 2025, Purdue. You're going to need it.
Woof.
All right. Well, that will wrap us up for tonight. Thanks for listening to the show and listening to all 18 teams of the Big Ten get their final grades. We'll be back next week as we move on to the ACC. Well, any final thoughts?
Why does the Big Ten have so many teams?
All these conferences are going to have this many teams soon.
Why are
Crazy.
they still called the Big Ten? I mean, come on.
The Big 12 was already taken?
I mean, come on. Just don't do numbers.
All right. Well, thanks again for listening. If you haven't, please subscribe to the show, leave a comment, and let us know what you think about the grades for these teams in 2024. Until next time, I'm Street.
Burl.
Go Dogs.
Go Dogs.